Do it again. You all right? You
Yeah,
good?
I'm fine.
Let's move the microphone a little closer here. Why do you make that face? It bothers me so much. Welcome back to another reaction video. My son was in here talking to me, and he was making that face. And I said, well, we're just going to put that at the beginning of the video. So we are going to seriously take on history. You can shut the door. There you go. Yeah. So we're going to take on the whiskey ring scandal today. This is part 3 of the extra history look at Ulysses S. Grant's administration and the scandals that plagued that administration and for a long time led to his presidency being rated pretty low. But people are taking a fresh look at the actions of Ulysses S. Grant. I make no secret of the fact he's probably my all-time favorite American. So I am a little biased in his favor, but somewhere in the middle we'll find the truth. So if you didn't see the first 2 episodes of this reaction series, I'll put a link down in the description so you can check out episode 1. It'll link to episode 2. You can get all caught up. Definitely check out Extra History, one of my favorite channels. I love what they do. Let's dive into this one.
June 3rd, 1874, the White House. Grant has had enough of the corruption within his administration. With the country's economy still battered from the panic of 1873, the public will simply no longer accept the embezzlement and financial irresponsibility that now appears so normal. His previous Secretary of the Treasury, William Richardson, has just resigned due to the Sanborn scandal, where a tax agent shook down businesses for his own profit. And in his place, Grant appoints the reformer Benjamin Bistow, giving him a mandate to pursue corrupt officials and prosecute them wherever they may hide.
So give Grant a lot of credit here. This is the waning years of his second term. He is going to run for a third term in 1880, which does not work out and end up with Garfield as the nominee that year, but he did run for the nomination. But he's not just kind of sitting idly by and just accepting that, well, I did enough, and he's still trying to fight this stuff, even though he really has nothing left to run for at this point, except it is a midterm year.
But Grant doesn't realize how close that hunt will come right back to him. Because soon, Grant's new anti-corruption bloodhound will follow a trail straight to the Oval Office.
And he probably knew that, appointing this guy, that it could lead right up to people close to him, and that's what needed to happen, especially for somebody like Grant, who is so trusting of people close to him.
To his private secretary and close friend, Orville Babcock, setting Grant on a collision course with the man that he'd tasked to bring justice to his government. But before those forces collide, we'd like to thank World Anvil for supporting our mutual goal of forging great stories. By mid-1874, Ulysses S. Grant knew that the perception of his administration was becoming a problem. However,
yeah, it's a problem for a couple of reasons. It's one thing when there's corruption in an administration in the best of times. It's never good. It's never excusable. But when you're also in the midst of a financial crisis in your country, you're coming off a decade now since the American Civil War. You've been dealing with Reconstruction in the South. You're dealing with a lot of unrest in those places. You're dealing with civil rights issues, and people are losing their jobs. People are losing their homes. People are struggling to put food on the table. And they're looking at an administration, and they're looking at people in positions of power getting rich by taking advantage of other people.
He seemed a little unsure of what exactly to do about it. See, the 1870s had an active movement for civil service reform, especially attacking the spoils system.
Yep.
And Grant courted this movement to some extent. His opening of the Civil Service Commission was one signal to them, but in private, he seemed to think the reformers were a bit naive.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Grant kind of hitches himself a little bit to the likes of Roscoe Conkling, the senator from New York, who is kind of the poster boy of the civil service, of the spoils system, using his position to get friends and cronies in powerful positions.
After all, political appointments were one of the few ways presidents could reward or trade favors with powerful congressmen in exchange for policy, and no one really wanted to give that up. Still, Grant knew that he needed to be aggressive in pursuing corruption, since these scandals were becoming a potent attack on his presidency and legacy, creating headwinds for the 1874 midterm elections, by which time his opponents in the resurgent Democratic Party had coined the term Grantism to describe the runaway corruption taking place in Grant's administration. Not a good look, especially since most Americans were struggling after the Panic of 1873, making financial scandals even more toxic. And there were so many.
And on the surface, it doesn't seem like that's how it should be, right? Like, we should be as upset about scandals in government at any time. But people are more in tune to that stuff. Think about it. When things are going really well for you, and your life is good, and you're financially secure, you're less concerned about stuff going on in the outside world, right? Because you're comfortable, you're safe, you're feeling good. When things are not going well, you're looking for people to blame. It's why, for example, in the 1930s, the National Socialists, the Nazis, were able to rise to power in Germany because of the situation at home. It led them to be willing to go to extremes to correct it. So they were hyper vigilant about what was going on.
These scandals. In fact, for this series, there were so many to choose from, we have to blow by a ton of them. Like, for example, how nearly 40 family members of Grant benefited financially from his presidency, or a scandal in the New York Customs House, once again involving his buddy Babcock. However, Grant did try to clean up the notoriously dirty bureaucracy of Indian agents, men tasked with distributing food and medical aid to Native Americans on reservations. He did.
And again, there's no evidence that Grant actively was involved in corruption. He was just naive and permissive of stuff he shouldn't have been.
Fire dozens of corrupt clerks. Unfortunately, his first commissioner of Indian Affairs, his friend Eli S. Parker, the first Native American to serve in that role, also resigned under likely unfair accusations of corruption.
Yeah, Eli Parker's a good dude. He's actually the guy who writes up the surrender terms at Appomattox. There's a very famous interaction between Parker and Robert E. Lee at Appomattox, where Lee walks in and he sees Eli Parker, who by this point's a brigadier general on Grant's staff, and he says, well, it's good to see there's at least one real American here, and Parker very matter-of-factly replies and says, we are all Americans here, sir. Great stuff. I love Eli Parker.
So there's some taking the good
Seneca,
with the bad
Indiana.
here. But the biggest swing was putting the reformer Benjamin Bristow in charge of the Treasury with a mandate to hunt corruption. Now, this was a great decision as far as morality was concerned, but ironically, it would also politically damage Grant because Bristow, found corruption. Bristow started cleaning house at the Treasury, firing over 700 inefficient, unnecessary, or corrupt workers, including some big names, such as the supervising architect of the United States, a notorious big spender on projects. He also began tangling with a bunch
This is all what Doge was supposed to be. Remember Doge a couple years ago, the Department of Government Efficiency? Yeah, that didn't work out so well.
more high-up folks, such as the Attorney General, the Secretary of the Interior, and the Secretary of the Navy. Let's go down them one by one. Through a series of intrigues involving secret alliances within the cabinet, Bristow managed to get his hand on a document suggesting the Attorney General's wife had received $30,000 from the Pratt and Boyd Company in exchange for dropping a case against them. That's not good.
That's a lot of money,
He hired an investigator to look into the Department of the Interior, who discovered that the secretary had handed out lucrative contracts for land surveying to both the secretary's own son and President Grant's brother, Orville. Contracts, mind you, neither had performed any work on. And in that double yikes, that secretary as well was dismissed and replaced. Actually, only Bristow's feud with the Secretary of the Navy came to nothing. He was advised to back off rather than dig further, though that secretary would still later become embroiled in a huge scandal over financial improprieties in the Navy, including allegedly accepting kickbacks for no-bid contracts. 2 out of 3 with the third one kind of taking care of itself. Well, as Meatloaf said, that ain't bad. This political warfare not only netted Bristow some big wins, it also gained him allies in the cabinet. The new Secretary of the Interior, Zachariah Chandler, uncovered even more corruption than his predecessor had tolerated, including clerks that didn't exist yet still drew a salary.
So what happens in a situation like this is when they're able to get some momentum, when they're able to see some success with rooting out corruption, this is going to embolden people who are in positions of power and influence, who maybe are just as upset about corruption but were afraid to deal with it, felt they were powerless to deal with it, thought if they tried to do something about it, maybe they'd get turned on. But now that you can see, okay, this is going somewhere, I want to be a part of this. I want to help fix the problem. This is going to bring out the best in some people.
Similarly, the new Attorney General, Edwards-Pierrepont, would become a crucial partner in their next big investigation, the whiskey ring.
And that's a huge person to have on your side, the Attorney General. I mean, this is somebody who can make or break investigations for you.
Back in 1869, Grant had appointed General John McDonald, who had fought with him at Shiloh, as Internal Revenue Collector for the Missouri District. Based in St. Louis, one of his directives was to raise money in a slush fund for the Republican Party. Now, that is skeevy on its face, sure, but please remember, revenue collectors often took on this role of raising political donations. Like it was part of their job because, see the previous mention of how corruption had just been normalized. Now, Bistow, a Kentuckian by birth, and therefore primed to be pretty well versed in the distilling business, suspected major
What are you saying? You saying that people from Kentucky? It's totally true. Totally true.
Embezzlement of tax revenue in the Missouri District, and told Grant he would be investigating. Grant responded with encouragement, saying that, sure, well, you know what? I know at least one man who's honest out there, John McDonald, who, had been so nicely recommended by Babcock. What a guy. Except by 1874, when Bistow had opened his operation. McDonald was the linchpin member of what was essentially an organized crime operation. The scheme included every revenue collector in the St. Louis office, as well as distillers, distributors, and shippers. The central scheme went down like this. The U.S. government tracked whether taxes had been paid on whiskey or not by revenue officials affixing duty stamps, saying the...
So remember that this is a time when there aren't, like today we have taxes on so many things. The revenue that came into the federal government was much more focused and limited at this time, primarily through tariffs. But you did have, during the American Civil War, a temporary income tax that is issued for the first time, but that's not a permanent thing. But you do have, throughout American history, going all the way back to the beginning, taxes on things like whiskey. That's why we had a whiskey rebellion. So this is one of those other areas. And anytime there's an opportunity for money coming into the federal government, the people that have control over that money coming in, that's where the corruption happens. That's why we see corruption in the Customs House in New York. It's why we're seeing corruption here.
Distiller had paid the 70-cent per gallon tax. However, in reality, corrupt officials were allowing the distillers to pay only half that price while depositing the other half into a pot split by those in on the scheme. The result was the officials underreporting to the government how many barrels had been produced while diverting $2 million in tax revenue into the pockets of the ring. This was exactly what Bistow was suspecting, and he began recruiting secret agents, crusading journalists, and other officials in a clandestine operation to infiltrate the ring and gain evidence. Grant actually supported the investigation, at one point volunteering to distribute the corrupt officials to new posts in order to disrupt the ring and give Bistow a way inside.
Yeah, I mean, what does Grant have to gain by this? There's no evidence whatsoever Grant ever financially benefited. We know, if anything, Grant was struggling financially because he had people taking advantage of him, too. So he was a victim of some of the stuff that was going on with corruption and finances. So he has nothing to lose by it, nothing to gain by, being a part of it, because he's not. But by dealing with it, it's going to make him look better. It's going to make him look like he's on top of this.
However, they did nix that plan since it would provide early warning of an investigation. Though the ring was tipped off anyway. In fact, Bistow intercepted cryptic messages between agents for McDonald and none other than, guess who? Babcock, that appeared to warn of a coming raid. In return, McDonald reportedly sent Babcock 2 $500 bills in a cigar box. Interesting side note, early on, Babcock had apparently also tried to block Bistow sending agents to St. Louis. Still,
Of course.
Bistow got his secret agents in place and managed to gather enough evidence to make the case. And not just in St. Louis, but also Chicago and Milwaukee.
Oh my gosh.
He even communicated with his investigators in a custom cipher, not even trusting his own department. Then in late April, Bistow got a big break. See, McDonald realized investigators were closing in. So he went and showed up at Bistow's office in Washington, D.C. to confess everything. It was the final piece needed to close the net. On May 10th, under Grant's order, Bistow launched a dramatic series of raids across multiple cities that shut down distilleries.
I'm just picturing like when you watch The Untouchables and you see it's a fictionalized version, of course, but you see Elliot Ness making the raids on the warehouses where all of the illegal whiskey is being held.
And seized financial records. In the wake of those actions, he brought 350 indictments against distillers, treasury officials, and McDonald himself. They brought forward evidence of not just tax evasion and skimming revenue, but also...
You have the federal government losing out on millions in revenue at a time when the country is in a financial panic. And they're already struggling with money, and they're probably trying to get more money out of people who already don't have it.
The reuse of duty stamps, mislabeling whiskey proof for tax reasons, and shipping whiskey labeled as vinegar. General McDonald would ultimately be convicted, fined, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. And in July, Bistow and Attorney General Edwards-Pierrepont confronted Grant with evidence that Babcock was in on it, feeding McDonald information about the investigation in exchange for a taste. "Let no guilty man escape," Grant grumbled. Stunned, he said that if this was true, Babcock had perpetrated, quote, "the greatest piece of traitorism to me a man could possibly practice." But you know, that was before Little Worm-Tongue Babcock went to work on Grant. Though, Babcock...
Love the Lord of the Rings reference there with Worm-Tongue. He obviously knew how to play Grant. And as I've said repeatedly, Grant... I love Grant, but he was so naive when it came to his friends.
Babcock had been laying the groundwork for this turnabout for a while now. First of all, he pointed out to Grant that Bistow was clearly using the investigation to boost his profile in advance of a presidential run, which was true. At the time, Grant was still mulling a third term, and with this investigation, Bistow could sink Grant's possibility of running again and set himself up as a successor. Regardless, when the investigators and Grant confronted Babcock with 2 coded telegrams they'd intercepted, Babcock somehow managed to explain them away to Grant's satisfaction. But Bistow would not let up.
Good for him.
Okay, he said, if Babcock had nothing to hide, then he could prove it by contacting the person who'd sent the coded telegrams and ask him to come in for questioning. They left Babcock alone to write the telegram contacting this person, and when they came back to check on him, he was instead writing a telegram warning his compatriot to stay away.
Unreal.
As a result, they indicted Babcock for tax fraud, and Grant got real hinky. First, at Babcock's suggestion, Grant tried to get the trial turned into a military court-martial. He also stacked the panel with people who would acquit his favorite aide, including one financially entangled with Babcock. This was so dubious, the panel itself decided not to go forward, and Babcock went to trial in St. Louis.
There's no way you can defend this. I mean, there's no way you can defend what Grant's doing here. He's enabling this kind of behavior in this situation.
Grant, now fully believing the trial to be a direct attack on his presidency, told his cabinet that he had decided to travel to St. Louis and to stand as a character witness in Babcock's defense. This horrified his cabinet, as no sitting president had ever taken the stand, and even the opening stages of the trial had been a media circus.
So no sitting president had ever taken the stand, but I can think of one instance where a sitting president pulled something like this to help a friend, and that was during the trial of Dan Sickles, who was a congressman who had shot his wife's lover, Philip Barton Key. Well-known story. He gets off on temporary insanity. It's the first use of that successfully in American history. And at one point, he orchestrates President James Buchanan walking in and going over and shaking his hand in front of the entire jury and in front of the entire courtroom. Media circus.
They did manage to talk him down to just giving a deposition, which would be taken at the White House.
Oh,
so Grant gives the testimony in the presence of the Attorney General under the supervision of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In it, he lauds the prosecutions of the whiskey ring, but insists that his faith in Babcock has not been shaken. The transcript is then read to the jury 3 days later, supported by the in-person testimony of General Sherman. And in the end, the jury acquitted Babcock, largely due to the personal intervention of his close friend, the President of the United States. But all that really did was buy Babcock just a little more time. For 7 weeks later, Babcock would be indicted again, this time for involvement in the safe burglary conspiracy. What's the safe burglary conspiracy, you ask? Well, we are running a little low on time, so I think I'm just going to speed run this one. The U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. wanted to get rid of a prominent reformer critical of the D.C. government and Grant administration. So, this U.S. Attorney concocted an entrapment scheme that involved Secret Service agents staging a break-in at his own office, blowing open...
Remember, Secret Service at this time, we think of Secret Service as being protecting the president, but the Secret Service is part of the Treasury Department. And at this point in history, it had just been created by Lincoln right at the end of his presidency. They are Treasury agents. That's primarily, they're dealing with counterfeit and things of that nature.
His own safe with explosives, then removing, quote, evidence in an ongoing case that they'd planted there. Originally, the agents were supposed to hand those, quote, stolen documents over to the critic, creating, quote, evidence that would lead the U.S. attorney to arrest him, but the critic smelled something fishy and wouldn't open the door for the agents. So instead, the agents paid 2 thieves to lie on the stand that the critic had hired them for the break-in. And that whole convoluted mess, of course, fell apart on the stand when the thieves, then the Secret Service, turned state's evidence and admitted the whole thing. Babcock was named as the go-between who'd recruited Secret Service agents for the convoluted...
Like, Grant, seriously, how much evidence do you need that this guy is in on this stuff?
...plot. There was never any evidence, however, and he was let off again, but his...
Well, there answers that question. How much evidence do you need? Well, there is no evidence, and absent anything that's going to slap Grant in the face and say, see, he's clearly guilty, which they certainly had the last time.
Political reputation, finally, was ruined. Grant, then bowing to public pressure, dismissed Babcock as his personal secretary. 5 days before the end of his term, Grant made Babcock a lighthouse inspector, a role he was actually well qualified for since he had been a talented military engineer. Though Babcock did die on the job in 1884, drowning in a storm while supervising the construction of a lighthouse in Florida.
Wow, and that's just a year before Grant himself died in 1885.
Now, unfortunately, the whiskey ring and the safe burglary conspiracy were not the last black eyes for the Grant administration. Yeah, this story sort of feels like a real stop hitting yourself situation, but they weren't done. There were financial scandals involving both secretaries of the Army and Navy. The Secretary of the Army actually came very close to impeachment. Oh, and Grant also pardoned McDonald 18 months into his sentence. Can't forget that one. By that time, Grant's anti-corruption team had already broken up, with both Pierpont and Bistow departing within months of Babcock's acquittal. Bistow did indeed try to run for president in 1876, but lost the nomination to Rutherford B. Hayes. Ulysses S. Grant exited the White House after 2 terms. Personally popular, but with the country having grown tired of him. Yeah. These scandals had helped burn the political...
The country was exhausted in general from not only all the crony politics, but, still reeling from the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And it's just a really, really difficult time in American history where there's just a lot of this kind of crap that was going on. And it's also the time where you're in the Gilded Age now, and you're dealing with the rise of what we call the robber barons, the likes of people like John D. Rockefeller, who are going to, just make a ton of money.
Capital he'd used to support Reconstruction, and in the 1874 midterms, Democrats retook control of Southern state governments and began rolling back the progress Grant had made on black civil rights, a first step on the road to Reconstruction's failure in 1877. And for nearly a century, Grant's reputation remained stained by the scandals of his administration. And while that's begun to change a bit, his scandals remain a cautionary tale.
There's Doge.
Though Grant was personally honest, he also put personal loyalty over the rule of law, a decision that cost him, and sadly, many other less powerful people.
And this is a great point to make here. This isn't just Grant being victimized because his friends took advantage of him. Because he was naive to a fault and loyal to a fault to people he had no business being loyal to, because he allowed those people to take advantage of that loyalty, a lot of other people got hurt too.
Oh, so dearly. And while it's true that he never stole money from the public, what he did steal was the public's trust. Something ultimately, in a situation like being the president of the United States, is far more valuable to the people of this country. But we should also remember that this horrible era of scandal is part of the reason we ultimately did get public service reform, why it became popular to rally against cronyism, nepotism, and why we established tougher laws governing things like bribery, conflicts of interest, and stealing from the public purse. Because
unfortunately, it takes a lot of crappy things happening for us to make the necessary changes. Now, we're still not always good at that. There's a lot of crappy things that happen that we still ignore and don't deal with. But sometimes we eventually make our way to doing the right thing after enough stuff happens.
Seems that corruption needs to become clearly visible before there's any political will to fight it. And corruption's visibility these days is not in short supply. So maybe this is a lesson that can give us a bit of hope that one day things such as crypto schemes, officials betting on prediction sites, and politicians suing the government for big payouts from the taxpayers will be sitting in a textbook alongside the whiskey ring as examples of crimes against the American people of an era long past.
All right, I think that was actually a very fair look at Grant's scandals during his administration. I think they did a pretty good job of evaluating it and making a little bit of a tie to the modern era without stepping too far into politics. I think that was all very well done. I want to thank D-Rod1517 and Ryan, just Ryan. That's all it says. Thank you both for your support on Patreon. Thanks for watching.